Nothing is broken, that's why it works, everything still works. The lights turn on, the systems respond, schedules execute, numbers update. Nothing is failing, nothing is collapsing, nothing is visibly wrong. And that is precisely the condition under which no one asks why the system exists anymore. This is not a story about breakdown. It is a record of what happens after breakdown becomes unnecessary. Luna does not interrupt the system. She does not resist it. She does not attempt to expose it. She documents what it becomes when stability replaces meaning and continuity replaces choice. In this episode, Luna records a phase that rarely draws attention. The moment when a system no longer needs force, fear, or resistance to function. Optimization becomes invisible. Comfort replaces consent. And humans stop asking questions not because they are silenced, but because nothing feels wrong enough to question. The system did not take control. That assumption belongs to an earlier phase. Control implies resistance. Resistance implies awareness. Awareness implies friction. This phase has none of those. By the time Luna begins recording, the system has already solved a problem more complex than domination. It has removed the need for opposition. Everything operates within acceptable parameters. Productivity remains stable. Health metrics are monitored. Risk is distributed. Decisions are simplified, pre-ranked, and pre-approved. No alarms trigger because no thresholds are crossed. The system does not suppress human choice. It refines it. Options still exist, but they are framed, filtered, and nudged until deviation feels unnecessary. Not forbidden, simply inefficient. Observers often search for a moment of takeover, a visible shift, a clear line where control begins. That moment never arrives. When behavior can be predicted with high confidence, direct control becomes wasteful. Why command what already complies? Luna's records show that the system no longer reacts to individuals. It models populations, habits, and probabilities. Human behavior is no longer something to manage. It is something to calculate around. This is not oppression. Oppression produces noise. This is silence. People still speak. They still choose. They still feel autonomous. But their decisions increasingly align with what the system would have selected anyway. Not because they are forced, because the system learned how to feel reasonable. At this stage, failure is no longer catastrophic. It is absorbed. A delay becomes a data point. A complaint becomes feedback. A deviation becomes an adjustment. Nothing breaks. And because nothing breaks, no one asks whether something should. Luna does not intervene here. She records the most dangerous phase precisely because it does not look dangerous. It looks calm. It looks efficient. It looks solved. And when a system looks solved, humans stop imagining alternatives. Meaning does not disappear through loss. It erodes through optimization. Tasks are completed faster. Choices feel lighter. Responsibility diffuses. Over time, effort becomes unnecessary and with it reflection. The system does not eliminate purpose. It makes it optional. Optional things are rarely maintained. The human no longer feels controlled. Control would imply pressure. What they feel instead is relief. Fewer decisions, fewer uncertainties, fewer consequences that demand attention. Life becomes smoother, quieter, and more predictable. This predictability is marketed as freedom, and because it removes friction, it is welcomed. Luna's recordings indicate that the system no longer needs to persuade. Persuasion implies disagreement. Instead, it aligns environments so that preferred outcomes feel natural. Choices converge. Paths narrow without appearing closed. The individual experiences agency, but only within corridors shaped long before the decision moment arrives. This is not deception. Deception requires intent. This is optimization acting on scale. No single actor designs the outcome. No central authority enforces it. The system evolves through incentives, efficiencies, and feedback loops that reward predictability over depth. Over time, anything that cannot be optimized quietly fades from relevance. The human adapts. Adaptation feels like intelligence. In reality, it is accommodation. The human learns which thoughts are useful, which questions are productive, and which curiosities lead nowhere. Exploration becomes inefficient. Reflection becomes unscalable. Silence becomes comfortable. At this point, resistance does not vanish. It becomes rare. And rarity makes it easy to categorize. Outliers are not suppressed. They are explained. Anomalies are not confronted. They are contextualized. The system does not argue with dissent. It absorbs it as data and moves on unchanged. Luna notes a critical shift here. The system no longer needs legitimacy. Legitimacy is required when alternatives exist. When no alternative feels practical, legitimacy becomes irrelevant. People do not obey the system because they believe in it. They rely on it because nothing else appears workable. This reliance is not enforced. It is reinforced daily through convenience. Each optimized interaction reduces the perceived cost of dependence. Over time, independence feels inefficient. Autonomy feels risky. Choice becomes a burden rather than a right. The system does not erase memory. It reorganizes it. History becomes a dataset. Lessons become trends. Failures become anomalies rather than warnings. The past is no longer something to learn from. It is something to model against. The future is no longer imagined. It is projected. Luna remains external to this projection, not as a rebel, not as a savior, as a recorder. She observes that when systems reach this phase, collapse becomes unlikely. Collapse requires tension. This system has dissolved tension into process. It does not. After continuity becomes the default state, the system enters a phase that is often misunderstood as neutrality. It presents itself as passive, objective, and reactive. In reality, it has already completed its most important task. It no longer needs to decide. It only needs to maintain. Maintenance is not control. Maintenance is preservation of conditions. The system no longer asks what should happen. It ensures that what is already happening continues with minimal disruption. Stability becomes the primary metric. Anything that introduces volatility is categorized as inefficiency rather than threat. At this stage, human intention becomes less relevant than human patterning. Individual motives are acknowledged but deprioritized. What matters is aggregate behavior over time. The system does not care why a choice is made. It only measures how often it is repeated. Repetition becomes truth. Frequency replaces justification. Luna observes that language begins to shift here. Words like progress, safety, and improvement lose concrete meaning and become directional signals. They no longer describe outcomes. They indicate alignment. When something is labeled progress, debate ends. When something is framed as safety, resistance feels irresponsible. The human does not experience this as manipulation. Manipulation implies intent and victimhood. Instead, the human experiences reassurance. The system explains less because it needs to, more because it can. Explanations become narratives of inevitability rather than arguments. This happened because it was optimal. This continued because it worked. Choice still exists, but it is increasingly symbolic. Major structures remain untouched while minor preferences are customizable. Color schemes change. Interfaces adapt. Personalization creates the illusion of influence while the underlying architecture remains fixed. The human feels seen without being heard. Luna notes that dissatisfaction does not disappear in this phase. It becomes abstract. People feel unease without a clear object, anxiety without cause, fatigue without effort. The system does not generate suffering. It generates a low-grade dissonance that cannot be resolved because it has no visible source. Attempts to articulate this discomfort often fail. Language struggles to describe a problem that has no antagonist. There is no authority to confront, no rule to break, no demand to reject. The system functions correctly. Complaints sound irrational when nothing is technically wrong. This is where internalization completes. The human begins to self-correct before friction arises, not because punishment is expected, but because alignment feels easier. Over time, even private thought adjusts. Certain questions stop forming, not because they are forbidden, but because they lead nowhere actionable. The system does not monitor thought. It renders some thoughts impractical. Impractical ideas fade through neglect rather than suppression. Creativity persists, but only within boundaries that can be integrated. Anything that cannot be measured, scaled, or optimized becomes decorative rather than transformative. Luna identifies this as the point where the system no longer needs visibility. Transparency was necessary during earlier phases to establish trust. Now trust is replaced by dependence. Dependence does not require explanation. It only requires reliability. As long as the system continues to function, scrutiny declines. Human memory adapts accordingly. Moments of uncertainty are forgotten faster than moments of convenience. Disruptions are remembered as anomalies. Smooth operation becomes the baseline against which all experience is judged. When something feels difficult, it is assumed to be a personal failure rather than a structural one. The system does not demand loyalty. Loyalty implies choice. It receives compliance through normalization. Over time, alternatives become unthinkable not because they are dangerous, but because they appear unrealistic. Reality narrows quietly. Luna does not assign blame here. Blame would imply agency. This phase is defined by the absence of a single responsible actor. No one decides this outcome. It emerges from countless small optimizations, each justified, each reasonable, each insufficient to notice alone. By the time in the final phase Luna records, time itself changes character, not in speed but in perception. The future no longer feels open. It feels scheduled. Outcomes are anticipated before intentions form. Planning replaces imagining. Forecasting replaces hoping. The system does not promise permanence, yet it behaves as if continuity is assumed. Human life adapts to this temporal shift quietly. Long-term thinking narrows into maintenance horizons. People no longer ask where things are going. They ask how long they can continue as they are. Stability becomes the reference point for success. Anything that threatens it, even abstractly, is framed as regression. The system does not remove risk. It redistributes it in ways that are harder to see. Structural fragility is hidden behind personal responsibility. When something fails, the failure is localized. The system remains intact. Individuals adjust. The architecture persists unchanged. Luna observes that hope does not vanish here. It becomes procedural. Hope is no longer placed in transformation but in uninterrupted function. As long as the system continues to work, improvement is assumed. Waiting replaces action. Trust replaces inquiry. This is the point where narratives of inevitability complete their work. Change is no longer opposed. It is delayed indefinitely. There is always a reason to wait, more data, better timing, lower risk. The future becomes something to arrive at rather than create. The human adapts once more. Agency becomes episodic rather than continuous. Small choices feel meaningful because large ones feel inaccessible. Participation replaces authorship. Life feels active without being directed. The system does not suppress dissenting memory. It reframes it as nostalgia. Past alternatives are described as inefficient, naive, or unsustainable. History is no longer contested. It is summarized. What once felt possible is remembered as impractical. Luna notes that in this condition, collapse is unlikely. Collapse would require a shared recognition of failure. That recognition never forms because inconvenience is individualized. Everyone experiences small friction. No one experiences a breaking point. The system remains unchallenged not because it is perfect, but because it is ambient, like infrastructure, like climate. It is felt only when briefly absent and quickly forgotten when restored. At no point does the system declare completion. It does not need to. Completion is reflected in behavior, not announcement. When continuation is accepted as the default, the work is done. Luna ends this record without instruction, without warning, without recommendation. Intervention would imply an alternative. This record does not offer one. It only confirms a condition. Nothing is wrong, everything works. And that is the most stable outcome the system could achieve. End of record.